Irenaeus and Papias are the most important witnesses to help us answer the question on who wrote the Gospels, because they are the earliest sources to directly speak about Gospel authorship. Specifically, Irenaeus writes, "We have learned from none others the plan of our salvation than from those whom the Gospel has come down to us, which they did at one time proclaim in public, and at a later period by the will of God handed down to us in the Scriptures, to be the ground and pillar of our faith. For after the Lord rose from the dead, the apostles were invested with power from on high. When the Holy Spirit came down upon them, were filled with all his gifts, and had perfect knowledge. They departed to the ends of the earth, preaching the glad tidings of the good things sent from God to us, and proclaiming the peace of heaven to men, who indeed do all equally and individually possess the gospel of God." Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached to him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had also leaned upon his breast, did publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. Based on the way Irenaeus speaks in this passage, he is very confident, and he must have gotten his information from somewhere, given that the way in which he speaks implies that he knows for sure, or at least as sure as he can be, that what he says is true. And this is just not how someone would speak in this context unless they had direct access to a source from which they would have gained this information from. Furthermore, as will be shown later on, it is implied that Irenaeus had a source within this text itself. Irenaeus was a writer born around 130 AD. Polycarp died around 160 AD. This would leave a 30-year gap in which Irenaeus could learn under Polycarp. Specifically, Irenaeus learned under Polycarp when he was in his early youth. Irenaeus, in his letters, also tells us that he directly learned under Polycarp, and that he learned under Polycarp in the presence of other students. Although it is true that Irenaeus says that he was in his early youth, this does not entail that he was too young to retain information, as some have suggested. Firstly, a child is not just unable to remember things. There are obviously many cases in which you may experience something as a child, and then you can vividly describe it later on. Irenaeus himself tells us that he remembers it, as in the letter to Florinus he says, "I remember the events of that time more clearly than those of recent years. For what boys learn growing with their mind becomes joined with it, so that I am able to describe the very place in which the blessed Polycarp sat as he discoursed, and his goings out and comings in, and the manner of his life, and his physical appearance, and his discourses to people, and the accounts which he gave of his intercourse with John, and of those who had seen the Lord. And as he remembered their words, and what he heard from them concerning the Lord, and concerning his miracles and his teaching, having received them from the eyewitnesses of the word of life." Polycarp related things in harmony with the Scriptures. Given the fact that Irenaeus himself is telling us that he vividly remembers what Polycarp had done, we should give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he has the ability to remember things. For example, if I were to give a report from when I was a child, and I claim to vividly remember all the details of an event because it was an important event, for example, if it was the death of a family member, the burden of proof would not be upon me to prove my memory is correct. The burden of proof would be upon this person who says that I misremembered it. Because we don't just assume that our memories are faulty prima facie. Rather, the burden of proof is upon the one who doubts our memories. Or, if someone were to say that they have a good memory, and then to prove this they decided to give us a report about a past event in their life that they vividly remember, then surely this would be enough to prove that they have a good memory. Similarly, when Irenaeus claims to vividly remember and have a good memory of what Polycarp said, we should trust him until proven otherwise. This is strengthened by Hill's conclusion that the unnamed presbyter cited throughout Against Heresies, Book 4, chapters 27 to 32 is actually Polycarp. As pointed out by Bauckham, since it is the presbyter's oral teaching that Irenaeus presents in these passages, it becomes clearer that Irenaeus did not have fleeting contact with Polycarp when he was a boy, but was for some time a student of Polycarp and committed much of Polycarp's teaching to memory. Second, after Irenaeus tells us that Polycarp taught what he had learned from the apostles, he writes that there are other witnesses to the claim, the Asiatic churches and the men who succeeded Polycarp. From these other witnesses, Irenaeus could also learn what Polycarp said from other sources, and could also correct any misconceptions he had about Polycarp if he had any at all. Furthermore, when Irenaeus says that he was a boy when he learned under Polycarp, the Greek word that is being translated here to boy doesn't necessarily mean that Irenaeus was a child in the modern colloquial sense. The word had various different meanings across contexts, but to the Romans, which would be the context of Irenaeus, they believed that being under the age of 18 was sufficient to constitute being a boy in this sense. So, the argument falls apart because there's nothing in the text indicating that he was a child in the sense of being, for example, around 12 years old. On the contrary, the text seems to imply that Irenaeus was around the age of 16 to 18. A final consideration to bring up is that it is unlikely that Irenaeus is lying or fabricating this information. Firstly, there is no reason to accuse Irenaeus of lying here. That would be baseless skepticism, given that no justification can be given as to why we should believe that Irenaeus is lying. Remember, the burden of proof is upon the one who doubts the primary sources. People are not generally habitual liars, and thus an actual reason has to be given as to why we must believe that Irenaeus was lying. Secondly, Irenaeus' claims could be easily fact-checked given that he writes that the Asiatic churches and the other students of Polycarp testified during his day confirming what he says. It would be unlikely for him to claim this as an argument if he was lying, given that it would make it easy for other people to go out and fact-check his claims and learn whether or not they are true. It is unlikely that somebody would lie in a manner that would allow them to be disproven so easily. This is further strengthened by the communication networks amongst Christians allowing for the spread of information, which would allow for members of Irenaeus' audience to know who was and wasn't a student of Polycarp. Furthermore, when it comes to Irenaeus' letter to Florinus specifically, he is claiming that both of them saw Polycarp speak about what he had heard and directly learned from John. This was done in a personal letter to Florinus. It would be odd for Irenaeus to write Florinus a letter essentially arguing that Florinus remembers something and therefore should agree with Irenaeus if Florinus had no memory of such event and never experienced it. Florinus, if Irenaeus was lying, would be able to detect the lie very easily, and it would be easy for him to debunk it. As Richard Bauckham writes, since he claims to remember Florinus himself as also a member of Polycarp's circle, his reminiscence would not hold water as an argument directed personally to Florinus unless it had some substantial truth behind it. Similarly, John Behr writes that Irenaeus should have deliberately or inadvertently promoted a false picture of Polycarp is extremely unlikely, if only for the fact that he exhorts Florinus to return to what they both had heard from Polycarp on the basis of their shared memories. Irenaeus and Florinus, moreover, were not the only ones to have known Polycarp. Furthermore, Irenaeus' portrait of Polycarp, as seen in 3 separate works over several years, is so stable that it cannot be the product of vague memories, and too detailed and multifaceted, involving many claims, that it would be rather complex for it to be a deliberate deception. To put it another way, it would be unlikely for someone to fabricate a claim of this manner. For example, if someone wanted to convince you that they were at the store at 5 p.m., when in reality they were at their house, they wouldn't go up to you and tell you, "Oh, I couldn't have been at my house because you saw me at the store and we had a full-length conversation together." Rather, if someone were fabricating the claim that they were at the store, they would likely give an argument that wouldn't be as easy to debunk. Furthermore, the improbability of this being a fabrication is made more apparent by the fact that Florinus, at this point in time, was a Gnostic who disagreed with Irenaeus, and Irenaeus sought to bring him back to orthodoxy. If Irenaeus was lying, it would be like if someone who you disagreed with fundamentally wanted to lie to get you to do a favor, and so they decided to say, "Remember that time that I gave you $5? Yeah, well, you should do this favor for me because of that." Obviously, it is unlikely that anybody would even attempt to try such a thing to get a favor, because the obvious response from the person they're asking would just be, "That never happened," making it improbable. In a similar fashion, it is improbable that Irenaeus would invent this correspondence with Polycarp to try and convince Florinus. Finally, we have multiple attestation for Irenaeus' connections to Polycarp. Obviously, we have Irenaeus as covered before, but we also have the martyrdom of Polycarp, which states that Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. We should also note that Irenaeus' claim of being a disciple of Polycarp was received well by everybody in the church, despite the fact that they would likely have been able to disprove it if it were false. Overall, we have good reason to trust Irenaeus, and therefore it can be said that we can trust Irenaeus to tell us what Polycarp had said and taught. Furthermore, Perumalil points out that Irenaeus knew other apostolic fathers, which would therefore put him in a position to gather traditions on what was said by the apostles and Jesus, which further increases his reliability. Polycarp was born around 70 AD and died around 155 AD, which meant that although he was, for example, born after the death of Peter, he was still able to be instructed by the Apostle John because John was old enough to reside in Ephesus until the times of Trajan. Not only is it just possible that Polycarp had connections with John, it is highly likely given the multiple sources for this claim. Irenaeus, Polycarp's own student, directly claims in a private letter to Florinus that Polycarp relayed information that he directly received from John. This is also stated elsewhere by Irenaeus. Similarly, the martyrdom of Ignatius, which was composed by Ignatius's disciples, also speaks of Polycarp being Ignatius's fellow disciple and Bishop of Smyrna, who had been a disciple of Polycarp. We also have Tertullian, who writes that the churches have kept records of succession and that the church in Smyrna records of Polycarp's appointment by John. Even Polycarp himself says that the apostles preached the gospel to him. Preaching is oral and requires direct contact between Polycarp and the apostles preaching, as Polycarp actually needs to hear the words from the apostles for it to constitute him being preached to by the apostles. Even though this doesn't directly specify that John taught him, it does show that Polycarp has apostolic instruction, something which is also made probable by his relatively close dating to the apostles, specifically John. Now, someone might argue that John was too old to have taught Polycarp, and at first it may seem improbable that John lived until Trajan's reign, given that he was learning under Jesus at 30 AD. However, New Testament scholar Craig Keener makes some useful points in this regard. Firstly, it is likely that John was just a teenager during Jesus' ministry, and although living to an old age was not necessarily common, the idea that just one of the disciples lived to an old age is not improbable, given that we have plenty of other examples of old teachers and leaders in antiquity. Furthermore, we know from Quadratus that eyewitnesses were present and taught Christians during his time, making it very likely that Polycarp, a contemporary of Quadratus, also heard from the eyewitnesses. As will be spoken of later, Papias, the companion of Polycarp, also had connections to the eyewitnesses during his lifetime, which in turn demonstrates the likelihood of Polycarp hearing from the eyewitnesses, given the closeness between Papias and Polycarp, and the emphasis that both had on apostolic or eyewitness preaching. The communication networks between Christians being vast and strong, which allowed for the spread of information, further strengthens this point, as the eyewitnesses would certainly wish to spread information and teach Christians during their lifetime. Polycarp, being one of these Christians, would likely be someone taught by them. This is especially the case given that Polycarp was prominent in the church. Overall, given the strength of the evidence we have, Petrie writes, "There should be no need to press the claims of Polycarp to be associated with the apostles." Irenaeus tells us that Polycarp always taught the things which he had learned from the apostles, and that when he and Anicetus disagreed, he would refuse to budge because Polycarp would not cease to observe what he had done with John and the other apostles. Therefore, it seems that Polycarp both taught and cared deeply about what the apostles said. Thus, it is highly important what he taught about the Gospels, as it shows us essentially how John's own student viewed the Gospels. The question, therefore, is whether or not Polycarp believed that the Gospels originate with the eyewitnesses. Two main arguments can be given. Firstly, Polycarp considers the Gospels authorities, and second, he is likely a source for Irenaeus' claims. Polycarp quotes sayings found in Matthew and Luke, and the way that Polycarp quotes them indicates that he gives authority to these texts. Although Polycarp does not directly quote from the Gospel of John, he does quote a Johannine epistle, and Charles Hill points out that Polycarp's letter reflects knowledge of the fourth Gospel. Furthermore, it is likely that Polycarp used and knew of Mark and Acts. For example, Polycarp says that Jesus is a servant to all, which mirrors Jesus' saying in Mark 9:35 that anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. Likewise, the statement, "whom God raised, having loosened the pangs of Hades," is also likely based off of Acts 2:24, and the statement, "he comes as the judge of the living and the dead," is likely from Acts 10:42. Polycarp using these texts in his letter indicates that he viewed them as authorities, and given Polycarp's desire to follow what John and the other apostles taught him, it would be unlikely that he would accept the Gospels as authorities unless they had some form of apostolic backing. Furthermore, Irenaeus says that all of Polycarp's teachings came from the apostles and were in line with Scripture, which includes the Gospels. And thus, we can say that the Gospels are, at the very least, in line with what the apostles taught. Polycarp viewing the Gospels as authorities raises the question of why he did so. After all, what is so special about the book Polycarp uses that makes them so authoritative? The concern is especially strengthened by Polycarp's desire to stick to the apostolic tradition. The best explanation which explains why Polycarp quotes them is that he knew about the origins behind the Gospels, and he knew that the Gospels are either based by or based off of what the apostles said. Of course, we can try to explain Polycarp's reliance upon the Gospels with other explanations. That is certainly possible, but it isn't probable. those alternate explanations are not as powerful as the one I posited first. My explanation is not only possible, but it is made probable by the fact that it is in harmony with the other historical evidence we have available, that being the testimony of Papias, Irenaeus, and the rest of the church. Polycarp was also a companion of Papias, who was another apostolic father who had also seen the Apostle John. This same Papias wrote about the authorship of Matthew and Mark, and specified that Matthew the Apostle wrote Matthew, and Mark the scribe of Peter wrote Mark. Charles Hill has also convincingly argued that Papias wrote about Luke and John as well. Therefore, Papias speaks about all four Gospels, which shows that the authorship of the Gospels was something which was thought important enough to write about, at least by one contemporary of Polycarp. Given that Polycarp both viewed the Synoptics as authoritative and lived in a time which the authorship of the Gospels was considered at least somewhat important, it is therefore not unlikely that Polycarp spoke of the authorship of the Gospels or learned of it like Papias had. Finally, Simon Gathercole points out that it is common sense to infer that once the Gospels were read by others and viewed as authoritative, those people would ask, says who? That is, who wrote these documents and why should they be considered authoritative? This not only applies to Christian communities as a whole, but can also apply to Polycarp, as when he would have read the Gospels, it is likely that he would have wanted to know where they came from. Similarly, it would also be likely that Polycarp's students, such as Irenaeus, would have wanted to know where the Gospels originated from. The facts that 1. Polycarp uses the Gospels as authorities, 2. Polycarp having knowledge about the origins of the Gospels explains his usage of them, 3. Polycarp's contemporaries were concerned with Gospel authorship, and 4. It is likely that Polycarp and his disciples would have wanted to know about the Gospel authorship, makes it likely that Polycarp would have at least said something about the authorship of the Gospels. Now, if Polycarp did say something about the authorship of the Gospels, then either he contradicted traditional claims of authorship or he confirmed it. If Polycarp had contradicted it, then it would be unlikely that Irenaeus, someone who studied under Polycarp and revered Polycarp, would contradict Polycarp's view of the Gospels, especially given his connections to John, and yet we know that Irenaeus did believe in traditional authorship. There is also the fact that we have no sources or reason for the claim that Polycarp contradicted the traditional view. Therefore, it is likely that he confirmed the traditional claims of authorship, that is, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels, as Irenaeus says. Finally, Polycarp is likely a source for Irenaeus' writing on the authorship of the Gospels. Irenaeus begins Against Heresies Book 3 with a passage on the authorship of the Gospels by giving an account of what the apostles did. That is, they wrote the Gospels. He does so, however, in a way that makes it seem like his tradition is just an accepted fact in the church and is something obvious, indicating that he was relaying something which he had learned from others and which everyone else knew. The question is, of course, how could he have been so sure, and how would he know what the apostles had done or had not done if he had not seen them? Luckily, there is a passage that answers this question. In Against Heresies Book 3, Irenaeus writes, "It is within the power of all, therefore, in every church who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world. And we are in a position to reckon upon those who were by the apostles instituted bishops in the churches, and to demonstrate the succession of these men to our own times." Although this passage was not directly about how he knew of the authorship of the Gospels, it can be inferred that this tradition about the Gospels has the same justification. According to Irenaeus, Polycarp was a man who departed this life having always taught the things which he learned from the apostles, and which the church has handed down, and which alone are true. Although Irenaeus is likely being hyperbolic in saying that nothing else besides what the apostles taught, which is handed down to him via Polycarp in the church, is the only thing which is true, as there are of course things which the apostles didn't speak about, and yet even he believes. For example, Irenaeus knew facts about his life that only he would have known, and so therefore the apostles could not have taught it. But his general point is that there is no truth pertaining to the faith which is true, and yet is not transmitted via the church or from the apostles. Obviously, what the apostles did and wrote would be something pertaining to the faith, and therefore we can say that it either falls into the category of things Polycarp learned from the apostles or things the church has handed down. If we say that it is something Polycarp had taught, then obviously the conclusion that Polycarp confirmed what Irenaeus said is a true conclusion. If, however, we say that it is part of the second category, then the conclusion that it is from Polycarp still follows. This is because Irenaeus, in the same passage, says that what Polycarp proclaimed was one and sole truth from the apostles, that namely which is handed down by the church. Therefore, what the church teaches, so too did Polycarp. The argument can be restated as, 1. Irenaeus says that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 2. Irenaeus had a source. 3. Irenaeus' two potential sources are church tradition and Polycarp. 4. If his source is church tradition, then Polycarp would have agreed. 5. If his source is Polycarp, then Polycarp would have agreed. 6. Therefore, Polycarp agrees with Irenaeus. Finally, in Against Heresies Book 4, Irenaeus also records the following. After this fashion also, did a presbyter, a disciple of the apostles, reason with respect to the two testaments, proving that both were truly from one and the same God. The point made by Gathercole is once again important. If people read the Gospels, they would have asked who it is from originally. In the same sense, it would be hard to imagine someone proving that both testaments, which includes the Gospels, are from one and the same God without mentioning the origins of the Gospels and how we got them at all. Now, although Irenaeus does not directly mention the authorship of the Gospels in this passage, he does not need to because that is not what this passage is about. Instead, he brings up the fact that the presbyter proved the testaments were from the same God for a different purpose. Yet the point still stands that it would be inconceivable for someone to prove the Gospels were from God and yet not mention their origins and authorships at the same time at all. For instance, the Old Testament texts and many of the other New Testament texts, such as the epistles, had attributions to authorship. Are we expecting the elder to speak about how the Torah are the books of Moses, but when he gets to the first Gospel, he merely doesn't comment on its composition? Furthermore, the need to prove the two testaments are from the same God came from the need to respond to the Gnostics and to the Jews. In these contexts, it would be highly important to establish the composers of these texts as having apostolic authority to help defend against Gnostic beliefs. Even Irenaeus himself uses this strategy. Are we to suggest that this presbyter somehow did not do this despite the fact that Irenaeus, who would have learned extensively from him and thus represent his tradition, does this? Why posit such a disunity between teacher and student here? Furthermore, are we meant to suspect that the says who question pointed out by Simon Gathercole would have not popped into his head, or in Irenaeus' head, in these lessons on the two testaments? Clearly, therefore, the authorship of the Gospels would have been mentioned. Furthermore, if Charles Hill is right about his conclusion that this presbyter is Polycarp, then that strengthens the position that Polycarp had something to say about the origin of the Gospels. There is, once again, a dilemma which is formed. If this presbyter spoke about the authorship of the Gospels, he either confirmed what Irenaeus said or denied it. If he denied it, then the same question of why Irenaeus would have given his report about the authorship of the Gospels arises. If the presbyter affirmed what Irenaeus says, then the conclusion that someone who directly knew the apostles believed that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is correct.